They say that some tombs are meant to remain undisturbed, but for a group of thieves, the call of the grave was too tempting to ignore. In the dead of night, they dug, their hands trembling as they unearthed what should have been left buried. What they didn't know, however, was that some secrets, especially those buried in the earth, are never meant to be unearthed. These grave robbers thought they were just after valuables, jewels, and trinkets that had long been forgotten. They didn't believe in curses or spirits. But when they stumbled upon an ancient tomb, sealed for centuries, they awakened something far worse than any treasure they could have imagined. One by one, the thieves began to vanish, their bodies turning up in the most horrific of ways. Some say it was just bad luck. But what if it wasn't? What if it was the curse of the tomb? A curse that had been waiting patiently for someone foolish enough to disturb it. What began as a typical grave robbery turned into a nightmare none of them could have ever prepared for. And now, the question isn't whether they will escape, but who will make out alive and who will be dragged into the ground with them. Tonight, we dive into the terrifying tale of the grave robbers who made the mistake of waking the dead. And believe me, this is one grave you don't want to open. But if you're brave enough to listen, stick around to hear the truth behind the curse that doomed them all. The night was thick with fog as the thieves gathered around the ancient tomb. The moon barely pierced a mist, casting an eerie glow over the graves they had desecrated. They had thought this job would be like any other, a quick in and out, no one the wiser. But as they stood before the tomb, its stone entrance untouched for centuries, they could feel something was different. "Let's get this over with," Mark, the leader of the group, said. His voice trembled slightly, but he hid it behind his bravado. "We've come this far. This will make us rich." The other men nodded, their hands shaking as they began to pry open the heavy stone door. The sound of ancient stone scraping against stone echoed through the cemetery, sending a chill through their spines. It felt wrong, but the lure of riches overpowered any sense of hesitation. As the door creaked open, a gust of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. The thieves recoiled but pushed forward, determined to see the treasures that lay within. The tomb was dark, but they could make out outlines of old relics, cobwebs draped over forgotten treasures. Gold, jewels. But as they stepped further inside, something caught Mark's eye, a symbol etched into the wall. It was old, ancient, and unmistakable. A warning. "Guys, we need to leave. Now." The words caught in Mark's throat as he saw the others hesitating. But it was too late. With a loud crack, the tomb door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. Panic set in as the air grew colder and the shadows grew darker, seemingly alive and watching. The men tried to escape, but the stone door wouldn't budge. They hammered at it with all their might, but it was no use. They were stuck. That's when the first of them disappeared. Paul, the youngest of the group, was the first to scream. The others turned in time to see him stumbling backward, his hands clutching his throat as if he couldn't breathe. His eyes bulged, his mouth open, but no sound came out. It was as if something was inside him, pulling him into the dark corners of the tomb. Mark rushed toward him, but as he reached out, Paul's body lurched violently, as if yanked by invisible hands. With a final, horrible scream, Paul vanished into the shadows, leaving only the echo of his terror behind. The men were frozen in place, fear gripping them so tightly that they could barely move. The air around them thickened, and the floor beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a strange energy. "What the hell is happening?" whispered Jacob, his voice trembling. "This isn't real, this isn't real." But as he spoke, the walls of the tomb seemed to close in. The temperature dropped further, and the flickering light from their torches cast eerie shadows on the walls. Then the whispers began. At first, they were barely audible, low murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. But soon, the whispers grew louder until they filled the tomb, ringing in their ears, scratching at their sanity. The voices were speaking in languages none of them could understand, but there was one thing they all knew. They were being watched. Then, one by one, the whispers started to call their names. Mark, Jacob, Tom. Each of them heard it, felt it. It was like a cold hand gripping their souls, drawing them deeper into the tomb. The presence in the dark was unmistakable. It wasn't just the dead that haunted these walls. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent. And then it happened again. Tom was the next to disappear, pulled into the shadows without a trace, his scream echoing through the tomb like a warning. The last two men, Mark and Jacob, were left alone in the suffocating darkness, terror seizing their hearts. Suddenly, the door that had once been sealed opened with a loud groan, but there was no light, no escape. Run! Mark shouted, grabbing Jacob's arm. But Jacob wasn't moving. His eyes were locked onto something, and when Mark turned to see what it was, he froze in horror. Standing before them, in the center of the tomb, was a figure, a man, or something that used to be a man. His skin was rotting, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. But the worst part? He was grinning, a twisted, impossibly wide grin that stretched from ear to ear. And in his hand, he held something, a key. "You woke me," the figure said, its voice deep and raspy, like the sound of 1,000 voices crying out at once. "And now you will join us." Mark tried to back away, but the tomb was no longer just a tomb. It was a prison. The walls closed in, and the darkness swallowed them whole. And then silence. The tomb was quiet once more. The whispers were gone. The presence faded. But when the first light of dawn broke over the cemetery, the tomb door was open once again. The grave robbers were gone. Their bodies were never found. But the tomb remained. The warning had been clear. Some graves are not meant to be disturbed, and those who dare to disturb them disappear. The sun rose, casting an eerie light across the cemetery, but there was no sign of the thieves who had entered the tomb the night before. The graveyard, usually silent and undisturbed, now felt wrong, like something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. As the day wore on, rumors began to spread through the nearby town. The grave robbers were gone. People whispered that the tomb they had tried to loot was cursed, that it had claimed them, pulled them into its dark embrace. And though most dismissed it as superstition, there was one man who couldn't ignore the chilling connection. Detective Mark Davis had heard the rumors, but he wasn't one for believing in curses or ghosts. He was a man of reason, but when he got the call, his skepticism was tested. The cemetery keeper had found something that wasn't supposed to be there, a small weathered notebook. It had been buried beneath one of the graves, the very one the robbers had targeted. Inside, the pages were filled with strange symbols, handwritten notes in a language Detective Davis didn't recognize. At first glance, it looked like nonsense, but there was one part that caught his attention. It was a warning. They who disturb the resting will never leave. Their souls will become mine, to be dragged into the tomb with me. The earth will swallow them whole, and they will be lost forever. Davis scoffed. Superstition. But then he flipped to the next page, and his stomach turned. There in black ink was a list of names. The robbers' names. Mark, Jacob, Tom, Paul, And there was one more name, scrawled at the very bottom of the page. Detective Mark Davis. His blood ran cold. How could someone have known his name? He wasn't involved with the grave robbers. He wasn't even in town when they disappeared. But as he stared at the name written in the notebook, something stirred inside him. A creeping, gnawing sensation that he couldn't shake. Later that evening, he visited the cemetery, the notebook clutched in his hands. The air was thick, the trees whispering in the wind as he stood before the tomb, the one the thieves had foolishly disturbed. His flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw movement inside. The shadows seemed to shift, but when he looked again, the tomb stood still, silent, as it had for centuries. But as he turned to leave, he felt it, a chill, cold and unnatural, seeping into his skin. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat as he heard a soft sound behind him, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, Mark Davis's heart pounded in his chest as he turned around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the cemetery. But there was no one there. The shadows seemed to stretch, pulling at the edges of his vision. And then, just as he was about to walk away, he saw it, a figure. It was standing by the tomb, a tall, gaunt figure, its face hidden in the shadows. It was dressed in tattered robes, and its skin, if it could be called that, was pale, stretched tight over bones. The figure raised one long, bony hand, pointing directly at Davis. "You're next," it whispered, its voice cold and rasping, the words dragging through the air like nails on a chalkboard. Davis froze. His flashlight flickered again, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. But the whispers lingered. "You're next. Join us." His breath quickened as he stumbled back, running toward his car, his mind spinning. The figure's words echoed in his mind. Had the tomb awakened? What had those thieves uncovered? And more importantly, why was he now involved? Back in his car, Davis gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady his hands. He had to know more. He had to find out what happened to the robbers and why they were never found. He had to see the tomb, go inside. But as he turned the key in the ignition, something caught his eye in the rear-view mirror. A shadow, standing just behind his car. And then the tapping began again. Quiet at first. Soft, deliberate taps on the back window. He didn't dare look. The tapping grew louder, faster. Then the voice. "Join us." Mark Davis's heart stopped as the voice, low and agonizing, filled the car. He slammed his foot on the accelerator and sped out of the cemetery, the sound of tapping following him like a dark omen. As he drove away, one last thing caught his eye in the rear-view mirror, the tomb standing in the distance, and beside it, the figure. It was no longer shadow. It was following him, and it was getting closer. The following days were a blur for Detective Mark Davis. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. Every night, as he lay in bed, the whispers followed him into his dreams. They were soft at first, like a distant breeze, but soon grew louder, more insistent. "Join us," they whispered. "The grave calls for you." He tried to dismiss it, but as the days passed, the symptoms of the curse became harder to ignore. He began to see things, shadowy figures lurking just beyond his vision, moving at the corners of his eyes. The tapping continued, louder now, relentless. It was as if the tomb itself was reaching out, drawing him closer, pulling him into its depths. It had been nearly a week since the encounter at the cemetery, and Mark knew he could no longer avoid the truth. He had to return to the tomb. He had to find answers, no matter the cost. One evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, he made his way back to the cemetery. This time, he was armed with more than just a flashlight. He had the notebook, the same one the robbers had found, and a sense of dread that gnawed at his insides. The air was thick with fog, just as it had been the night the robbers disappeared, and the cemetery seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. When Mark reached the tomb, it was just as it had been before, silent, undisturbed. The stone door was shut tight, but this time something felt different. The presence was stronger, more palpable. He approached the tomb slowly, his heartbeat quickening. He could feel the air growing colder, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Mark glanced at the door and saw the same symbol from the notebook, the one that had been carved into the wall of the tomb. But there was something new. The symbol was glowing. The faint light illuminated the dark, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance along the stone walls. Mark's hand shook as he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground beneath him rumbled, and the tomb door began to tremble. "No!" he whispered, stepping back. "This can't be happening." But it was. The door creaked open slowly, as though it were alive, its hinges groaning with the weight of centuries. The temperature dropped sharply, and Mark's breath became visible in the air, even though it was a warm evening. The darkness inside the tomb seemed to pulse, beckoning him to step forward. He didn't want to go in. He knew the danger. He had seen enough to know that whatever lay inside was not something he could understand, let alone fight. But the whispers, the relentless whispers, were growing louder in his head. They were demanding that he enter. "Join us!" Mark swallowed hard. He couldn't fight it anymore. Whatever force was calling him had already taken root in his soul. With one last, desperate glance over his shoulder, he stepped inside. The tomb was colder than he could have imagined. The air was thick, filled with a musty scent that made him gag. He could hear the faint sound of shuffling in the distance, like footsteps echoing in the dark. His flashlight flickered as he walked deeper into the tomb, the beam catching on the glistening symbols carved into the walls, their designs shifting unnaturally in the light. The deeper he went, the stronger the presence became. It was suffocating, like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He felt as though he were walking through a nightmare, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. And then he saw it. At the far end of the tomb, there was a pedestal, a large stone altar. On it lay an ancient chest, sealed with the same symbol that had been carved into the door. The chest was pulsing, as though something inside was alive. Mark's eyes locked onto it, and he could feel an overwhelming urge to open it, to discover what was inside. But then out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Figures, dozens of them, rising from the shadows, from the cracks in the tomb's walls. They were the same as the figure he had seen that night in the cemetery, the gaunt, rotting forms of the thieves. But there was something different about them now. They were no longer just shadows. They were real, solid, and they were moving toward him. Mark froze in terror as the figures surrounded him, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They reached out with skeletal hands, their mouths opening wide, but no words came out, only a soft, unnerving sound, the sound of bodies shifting, creaking like old bones. And then he heard it again, the voice now clearer than ever. "You woke us, now you'll join us." The figures reached out, grabbing at Mark, pulling him toward the altar. He struggled, but their grip was ironclad. As they dragged him toward the chest, he could see the faint outline of a figure emerging from the shadows, the one that had haunted him since the beginning, the figure with the key. the one that had cursed the robbers. It was smiling, and then, in a moment of horror, Mark realized the truth. He wasn't just a witness to the curse. He had become part of it. The tomb was not just a prison for the dead. It was a place where the living were transformed, trapped in the tomb forever, forced to become part of the darkness. As the lid of the chest opened, the last thing Mark saw was a figure's outstretched hand, beckoning him closer. And then everything went black. When Mark's consciousness returned, he was no longer sure where he was. He could feel the cold stone beneath him, the rough texture of the tomb's floor pressing against his skin. But his body didn't feel like his own anymore. His limbs were stiff, as if they were no longer capable of moving under his control. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to dim, flickering light that seemed to surround him. The tomb wasn't just a physical space. It was a twisted, shifting landscape that stretched in every direction. It felt as though it had no end, no walls, only a vast, empty void filled with shadows and whispers. The figures that had dragged him toward the altar were now standing around him, their empty eyes fixed on him with an unblinking gaze. They didn't speak, but their presence was suffocating. They were like an army of lost souls, condemned to roam the tomb forever. Mark tried to move again, but his body remained unresponsive. His hands twitched, and he realized that something was growing inside him. Something dark, something powerful. The presence was feeding on him, taking control, just like it had done with the grave robbers. He could feel it. His was slipping away, replaced by the cold, unfeeling grasp of the tomb. The whispers returned, louder than ever, echoing in his mind like 1,000 voices calling to him. "Join us," they said. "Become one of us." Suddenly, the shadows around him seemed to solidify, taking form. He saw the faces of the grave robbers, twisted, contorted, and eternally trapped in the tomb. Their bodies were no longer human. They had become something else. Their skin was decayed, their eyes sunken into their skulls, and their mouths hung open, frozen in agony. They were no longer individuals. They were part of the tomb now. "You will never leave," one of the figures whispered, its voice dry and cracked. "Once you're here, there's no escape. The tomb owns you." Mark's mind reeled. He knew what they were saying was true. He could feel it, his very essence being drained, his body becoming one with the darkness that surrounded him. He wasn't just trapped physically. He was becoming part of the tomb itself. He wanted to fight it, to resist, but the weight of the curse was too powerful. It was pulling him deeper, pulling him into the very heart of the tomb, where the darkness was thick and consuming. And then, through the oppressive shadows, he saw something. A figure, standing alone in the center of the tomb, shrouded in a cloak of darkness. Its face was hidden, but Mark could feel its presence. It was the figure from the cemetery, the one with the key, the one who had cursed the robbers. This figure stepped forward, and Mark could feel the cold air grow even colder as it approached. It moved with purpose, its presence commanding the room. The tomb seemed to quiet, the whispers fading as the figure's power took over. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure's voice echoed, low and menacing, yet oddly calm. "But now that you have, there's no turning back." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to speak, to beg for mercy, but his body betrayed him. His mouth refused to move, his words trapped inside. The figure raised its hand, and Mark felt a surge of energy rip through him. It wasn't pain, at least not in the way he had expected. It was a cold emptiness, as if his very soul was being siphoned out of him. He could feel his memories slipping away, his identity fading. He was becoming nothing more than another lost soul, another whisper in the tomb. "You've opened the door," the figure said. "Now you will join the rest of us. Forever." Mark's body began to dissolve into the shadows, his flesh turning to dust as he was pulled toward the altar. He wanted to scream, to fight, but it was too late. The tomb had claimed him. It was too powerful, too ancient. The curse was irreversible. As his vision faded and the shadows closed in, Mark saw one last thing, a glimmer of light, far off in the distance. It was the tomb's exit, the door he had entered through, now distant and unreachable. The curse had trapped him in eternal darkness, never to escape. The whispers continued, louder now, as the tomb grew silent once more. "You're one of us now," they said, and then everything went dark.